Hello and welcome to a special episode of CIS 1440. This is where I will discuss a little bit about Ajax with you and give you an example. I've already uploaded the code, so you should have access to it. And right here, we've got the HTML file that I created, and all it's doing is it's including the Ajax JavaScript source file that I've created over here. So if you download the zip file called Ajax XMLHttpRequest fetch, you can unzip it, and then from inside of Atom, all you have to do is go to File and then Open Folder, and then go to the folder that was resulted from the unzipping. So this right here is Ajax. It's fairly straightforward. This is not really formatting anything, but it will show you the output. So there's a span called output here, and there's a button called btn get data. And then down here, it's using the fetch API to show you how that works. And that uses output 2 and btn get data 2. So either of these APIs is fine. Or either of these techniques is fine. The XMLHttpRequest is the older technique, so you may see this actually quite a bit. The newer technique used with ES6 and higher, they do recommend for new builds that you use the fetch API because it's based on a concept in JavaScript called promises, which are basically objects that say, hey, when I'm done with this, I'll return a result. So they basically give you a promise of a future result. Now we'll look at how the code works in here. So first, handle button 1, if you'll notice, I set the event listener for window to start, and then for start, I grabbed the two buttons by their ID. For the first button, I associated it with the handle button 1 function, and for the second, I associated it with the handle button 2. Handle button 1 is the one that uses the XMLHttpRequest. So this right here is actually the URL of the API that we're using. This is called a REST API, and basically you just go to this, and the back end that they've set up generates a file. Now the file could be just HTML, it could be XML, which is actually where the name XMLHttpRequest came from originally. It could be plain text, or it could be JSON, which is a JavaScript object notation. It actually looks like JavaScript in many ways, and it actually looks with the notation you would use to create objects with JavaScript. Now you might ask, why are we even doing this? And the answer is there is a preference now, especially, but one of the big preferences is that we only reload portions of a page as needed rather than having to refresh the whole page or go to a completely new page. In fact, some frameworks and some techniques use what's called SPA, or single page applications, and things like React can do it, and Angular's big on it, and things like that. So all these different frameworks are really big with this single page application. So if we can just load part of the page, that keeps the flicker of the refresh from showing, number one, but it also makes the experience more streamlined, and it also, you're only loading the data you need instead of reloading a bunch of stuff that you don't. So if I go to that URL, this is from the JSON placeholder.tippy code, and I've zoomed in here, you'll notice that this is JSON. This is not XML, this is not plain text. At the end of the day, it's text, but it's in a format called JSON. And you'll notice there's a square bracket on the outside, and then at the very end there's another square bracket. That's because it'll recognize it as an array. When we parse it, it'll know, hey, that's an array. And then, except for the fact that these have double quotes on them, which would not be the case in regular JavaScript objects, these are the different keys, basically, and then these are the values. You'll notice some of them, like geo, actually have an underlying object as well. The curly braces indicate that we have a full object here, and then comma separates objects. So, oh, actually this one, looks like this one's one full object. There you go. This is ID 1. It has Leanne Graham in it. Username's Brett. And then you've got Irvin Howell. I think they've got some of the data off on these, but it doesn't really matter. Some of the usernames don't seem to match up with the person, but it's just for garbage data anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So you'll see that it has websites, longitude, latitude, it has city information and all this other stuff. There's the Open Weather API that has some similar stuff to it also. So this is just to give you an idea. So each of the objects has this information in them. Some of those objects are actually just strings like this. So if I access website, it'll give me this. If I access phone, it'll give me this. If I access company, though, that's a sub-object. So you can actually, once you parse it, you can use the dot notation to burrow down into this stuff. But notice the outermost thing is an array. ID 1, ID 2, ID 3, all the way to 10, because there are 10 elements in this array that are passed back. Now let's look at the code. Okay, well there's the code loaded, but let's look at the code. We create the request, we create the URL as a string, and we're getting a message ready that we're going to put in the span called output. And I'd put some extra console logs and stuff like this. We don't really need that, but that was to do some testing. I am actually logging stuff to the console as well, which is in F12. But you notice here's where the magic happens. You take the XHR, the XMLHttpRequest object, and at the onReady state change, we set function here, and inside of this, right here, this is the whole body of that function. This basically says when this occurs, this is the same as saying add, basically like add event listener. So this is saying, you would say add event listener, and then it would be ready state change. So you could do it that way, but we're doing it this way. You could separate the function out into a separate function and then just pass the name here, whichever you prefer, but a lot of people just do it this way. So this right here is the body of the XHR. Now, what it's testing is this will actually get called anytime the state change changes, anytime the state changes, rather, the ready state. And when it gets to 4, and if the status is 200, meaning it's good, right? So that means that the whenever you get a successful send of data over the web, then you get this 200 status. So if both of these things are true, now this is pretty much what you need for, I'd say probably 90-95% of any of these XHR requests you're going to make. It's going to look exactly like this in the outside if statement. Now if you don't put one of these or the other, you might see a bunch of stuff pop up. You know, if I put an else on this, for example, you might see a bunch of other stuff pop up. But what we're doing here is this is where the magic happens. We use this. This is actually built into JavaScript. You say JSON, all caps, .parse. And then you pass it the response text, which is automatically something. When I say this, it's talking about the ready state change, the XHR object rather. And then when you say response text, we know we're ready, so we grab the response text, and we know that we are receiving an array. So I just called it the array. In the fetch one, I didn't call it the array, but we'll see that in a minute. I'm using the for loop, and I'm going up to the array's length from 0 to the length. So it should be from 0 up to not including 10. So that would be 10 of them. I did do a console.log, but you notice how I'm accessing it. Every time I do the array at I, it's actually going to grab one of these. So when I say array at 0, it's actually going to grab this whole thing right there. And then if I want any of the components, I have to say dot ID, for example, or dot address. Now, if I say dot address and I want the street, I would say dot address dot street, and then it would give me Kula Slide, right? But here I'm just doing name, username, and email. So for the first element, it should be Leanne Graham, Brett, and then sincere@april.biz, right? So it's all basically junk data. But that's what that whole API is for you to play around with. Now, you can use, obviously, I would recommend you try finding another good API that's open for requests. I think Marvel Studios has one. DC Comics, I think, has one. Open Weather API is a good one that does like weather, and there's a bunch of other ones. So just do a little searching, and if you really can't find anything, you could come back to this one and just make better sense of the data in it. So while it's looping, all it's doing is it's concatenating to this message string that I created earlier with breaks, because it's ultimately going to be HTML. So I'm going to take the name with a break, the username and a break, the email, and then 2 breaks, so it separates usernames and the name, the username, and the email, and it separates whole bits of information or parts of information from different people in the array. And then at the very end, after the for loop, but still inside of this if statement, I set the spans inner HTML to that message. After the XHR object's set up, I actually have to initiate the process. So you open a Git using Git, the Git protocol. You pass the URL and then the value true, and then you call send. Once you do that, it will request the data, and you should get it back. So let's see what that looks like in the actual application. I'm going to click, I'm going to actually do F12 so you can see the console as well. But if I hit this, it does print out the data to the console, but it also prints out all this information that I just requested, right? Name, username, email, and then 2 breaks, so it goes to the next line, then the next line, then you get to Irvin and da-da-da-da-da, right? And I also looked over here. If you look over here, you can see that this actually breaks it down in a hierarchical form, more like the actual JSON, right? So you can, this is where I did console.log, so you can see different data that's subdata of the original. Pretty cool, right? Now, I'm going to refresh this, and we're going to look at the fetch. This is the one that's associated with the second button right here. And the fetch API is less code. It's a little bit different, but we still use the same URL. And by the way, this place has more than one URL. You can actually grab, if I put a number at the end of this, for example, I could grab one user at a time, and it wouldn't be an array. So you can do that. There's all kinds of stuff you can do with their API. Read up on it by going to this site, the jsonplaceholder.typicode.com. Now, I grab output 2 and, again, creating a message. When the promise from fetch down here, we fetch the URL. When it resolves, remember, because a promise is an object that says, hey, when I get a solution, I'll return to you. When it resolves, the first then executes the callback in its parentheses. So this knows when this is done, I can do this. Now this is using the fat arrow function, which is ES6 syntax. So you can find that in the new book, or on W3 Schools and a ton of different places. But basically what this is saying is that this is actually, if I, it's shortcut syntax for if I put a function here and passed it response as its parameter, and then this is the body of the function. So basically it's just a return. It's actually a return response.json, but that's all very shortcut. So you can see how fat arrow functions work. Just look that up, fat arrow function JavaScript. It's very, very simple. So fat arrow JavaScript, and pretty much any of these are going to have some sort of information. I would say actually free code camp's a really good example too. We'll say fat arrow function JavaScript W3 Schools, and they just call it the JavaScript arrow function. But it's like before, this is the old school version. Here's an example with the arrow function. This is a little more readable, right? Because it's got no parameters. It's got, the arrow just says, hey, there's the function associated with it, and we have a return statement. But this is the, if you only have one default value with return, you can actually do this. And in fact, you don't need the parentheses if you're putting it, using it directly either. So this would actually be the exact same as these two. So I would say it's very, very, it's pretty simple. It's just different syntax than you might be used to. So you can look at that. Now, if it's got parameters, it looks more like this. But then this right here is saying, you'll see we don't need the parentheses. So if it's got no, or if it's got a parameter, we don't need the parentheses. We could say that's the parameter, and then this is the value that's returned if it's only one line. If it's more than one line, you can, of course, use curly braces just like you would with any other function. Okay, so that's the JavaScript arrow function. Now, back to JSON with the fetch API. So again, fetch is newer. It says this is the parameter response that automatically gets passed in from when the fetch returns. Then it returns the response.json. That JSON data, the second then accepts the callback and executes when the response.json has resolved. .then, you can actually keep chaining .then as these things are waiting on more data. So this one returns the JSON. The JSON is now a parameter to the next then. And notice here with the fed arrow function, this is return, or this is the execution that's going on here. Oops. You will notice that since this is being executed here, it has to have curly braces, right? So it's not just returning a value. We would have to specify return if we wanted to return something. The catch is just if there's an error. So that one we're not considering as long as there's valid data. But look at what we're doing. We're doing essentially the exact same thing we did up here in the XMLHttpRequest, right? So we're putting together our message, and then at the very end, after the for loop, we set the message. You don't have to do any open or send or anything like that. The fetch API sets it up automatically for you. So it is shorter than using this, but you're really for the assignments, when I involve it, unless I say explicitly you have to use fetch, then you can use either. All right, so hopefully that helps. Let's look at it in action, but it does the exact same thing as the other one. So test, and it does the exact same thing, right? So get all of these. Same exact thing. They both work, right? Pretty cool. All right. Let me know if you have any questions. I hope this is useful. Thank you and have a great day.